Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The History of Florida. Edited by Michael Gannon. Narrated by Tiedemann. Introduction. Michael Gannon. It is a happy coincidence of history that within 3 years' time, Florida celebrates two major historical moments. The first, occurring in 2013, is the 500th anniversary of the documented discovery of the peninsula by Juan Ponce de Leon. The second, to take place in 2015, is the 450th birthday of St. Augustine, the oldest permanent European community in what are now the United States and Canada, antedating Jamestown in Virginia and Plymouth in Massachusetts by 42 and 55 years respectively. Consider the age of St. Augustine. Founded in 1565, it appeared on the scene 1 year after the death of Michelangelo and the birth of William Shakespeare. To tell the long recorded history of this state, the University Press of Florida in 1993 commissioned 23 historians, all leading authorities in their fields, to collaborate on a joint history. Published in 1996, the new History of Florida has had a consoling success. Now, that volume has been updated and enlarged by 3 new chapters and is offered as The History of Florida. Listeners will observe that most of the 25 chapters of this book follow upon each other chronologically. That is, Fortune and Misfortune, the Paradoxical 1920s, Chapter 17, is followed by the Great Depression, Chapter 18, which in turn is followed by World War II, Chapter 19. Certain subject areas, however, overlap several or numerous time periods, and these are treated thematically. Thus, Chapter 11, Free and Enslaved, treats African societies in Florida from the 16th century to the middle of the 19th century. Similarly, Chapter 12, Florida's Seminole and Miccosukee peoples, follows those peoples from their first arrival in Florida during the early 18th century as far as the 1900s. In this way, certain subjects of special interest are not broken up into segmented time periods, but are presented as studies in one continuous, connected form. 1. Original Inhabitants. Gerald T. Milanich. What is now the state of Florida was first settled by humans whose ancestors had entered North America from Eastern Asia during the Pleistocene era, the Great Ice Age, about 12,000 years ago. Sea levels, as much as 350 feet lower than at present because of huge amounts of water tied up in Ice Age glaciers, exposed a large land bridge between Siberia and Alaska across what is now the Bering Strait. Hunter-gatherers in search of game and other foods easily crossed this land bridge which connected Asia and North America, and was at least as wide as the distance from Orlando to New York City. These early hunter-gatherers are called Paleo-Indians, and they entered Florida around 10,000 BC, about the same time that they moved into other parts of what is now the United States. Evidently, their non-sedentary lifestyle and a new world filled with plant and animal foods never encountered previously by humans enabled, perhaps encouraged them to colonize the Americas quickly. Campsites of the Paleo-Indians are found across North America, from Alaska to South Florida. Some archaeologists argue that the Paleo-Indian migration was preceded by even earlier movements of people from Asia across the Siberia-Alaska land bridge into the Americas. But as yet, the evidence for such a pre-Paleo-Indian presence in North America is tenuous. Certainly in Florida, the Paleo-Indians were the first human residents. At the time of the Florida Paleo-Indians, the same lowered seas that created a transcontinental bridge across the Bering Strait gave Florida a total landmass about twice what it is today. The Gulf of Mexico shoreline, for instance, was more than 100 miles west of its present location. During the Paleo-Indian period, Florida was also much drier than it is today. Many of our present rivers, springs, and lakes were not here, and even groundwater levels were significantly lower. Plants that survived were those that could grow in the dry, cool conditions. Scrub vegetation, open grassy prairies, and savannas were common. Sources of surface water, so important to Paleo-Indians and to the animals they hunted for food, were limited. The Paleo-Indians sought water in deep springs, like Little Salt Spring in Sarasota County, or at watering holes or shallow lakes or prairies where limestone strata near the surface provided catchment basins. Such limestone deposits are found from the Hillsborough River drainage north through peninsular Florida into the Panhandle. Paleo-Indians hunted, butchered, and consumed animals at these watering holes, leaving behind their refuse, artifacts that can be studied and interpreted by modern archaeologists. Today, with higher water levels, many of these catchment basins are flowing rivers, like the Ichetucknee, Wassissa, Osceola, and Chipola. Paleo-Indian camps with bone and stone weapons and tools, including distinctive lanceolate stone spear points, are found in deposits at the bottoms of these rivers, as well as at land sites nearby. With the stone tools are found bones of the animals the Paleo-Indians hunted, some exhibiting butchering marks. A number of the animal species hunted by Paleo-Indians became extinct shortly after the end of the Pleistocene epoch, perhaps in part because of human predation. They include mastodon, mammoth, horse, camel, bison, and giant land tortoise. Other of the animals that provided meat for the Paleo-Indian diet, deer, rabbits, raccoons, and many more, continue to inhabit Florida today. After about 9,000 BC, as glaciers melted and sea levels rose, Florida's climate generally became wetter than it had been, providing more water sources around which the Paleo-Indians could camp. But as the sea rose, coastal areas were flooded and the Florida landmass was reduced. Less land and larger human populations may have influenced the later Paleo-Indians to follow a less nomadic way of life. They moved between water sources less frequently, and their camps were occupied for longer periods of time. Archaeological sites corresponding to these larger, late Paleo-Indian camps have been found in the Hillsborough River drainage near Tampa, around Paynes Prairie south of Gainesville, near Silver Springs, and at other locations in northern Florida. Paleo-Indian sites, relatively common in the northern half of the state in the region of surface limestone strata, also occur in smaller numbers in southern Florida. Paleo-Indian artifacts have been found as far south as Dade County. Over time, the toolkits of the Paleo-Indians changed as people altered their lifeways to adjust to the new environmental conditions that confronted them. They began to use a wider variety of stone tools, and many of the stone points originally used to hunt the large Pleistocene animals were no longer made. These changes were sufficient by 7,500 BC for archaeologists to delineate a new culture, the early Archaic. The environment of the early Archaic peoples was still drier than our modern climate, but it was wetter than it had been in earlier times. Early Archaic peoples continued to live next to wetlands and water sources and to hunt and gather wild foods. One remarkable early Archaic period site is the Windover Pond site in Brevard County, which contains peat deposits in which early Archaic people interred their dead. Careful excavations by Glenn Doran and David Dickel of Florida State University revealed that during the period between 6,000 and 5,000 BC, human burials were placed in the peat in the bottom of the shallow pond. The peat helped to preserve an array of normally perishable artifacts and human tissues, including brains, from which scientists have recovered and studied genetic material. Artifacts recovered by the excavation team included shark teeth and dog or wolf teeth, which had been attached with pitch to wooden handles for use as tools. Other tools were made from deer bone and antler, from manatee and either panther or bobcat bone, and from bird bone. Bone pins, barbed points, and awls were found preserved in the peat, along with throwing stick weights made from deer antler. The weights were used with a handheld shaft to help launch spears. The earlier Paleo-Indians probably also used throwing sticks. Animal bones found in the pond, presumably from animals eaten by the people who lived there, were from otter, rat, squirrel, rabbit, possum, duck and wading birds, alligator, turtle, snake, frog, and fish. Remains of plants, including prickly pear and a wild gourd fashioned into a dipper, were also preserved. A well-developed and sophisticated array of cordage and fiber fabrics and matting lay in the Windover Pond peat. Fibers taken from sable palms, saw palmettos, and other plants were used in twining and weaving. The early archaic people of Florida, like the people that preceded them and those that would follow, had an assemblage of material items, tools, woven fabrics, and the like, well suited to life in Florida. After 5000 BC, the climate of Florida began to ameliorate, becoming more like modern conditions, which were reached by about 3000 BC. The time between 5000 and 3000 BC is known as the Middle Archaic period. Middle Archaic sites are found in a variety of settings, some very different from those of the Paleo-Indians and early Archaic periods, including, for the first time, some along the St. Johns River and the Atlantic coastal strand. Middle Archaic peoples also were living in the Hillsborough River drainage northeast of Tampa Bay, along the southwest Florida coast, and in a few South Florida locales. And Middle Archaic sites are found in large numbers in interior northern Florida. The presence of a larger number of surface water sites than had been available in earlier times provided many more locales for people to inhabit. It is clear that during the Middle Archaic period, Florida natives took advantage of the increased number of hospitable areas. Populations increased significantly. The people practiced a more settled way of life and utilized a larger variety of specialized tools than their ancestors had done. By 3000 BC, the onset of the late Archaic period, essentially modern environmental conditions were reached in Florida, and expanding populations occupied almost every part of the state. Wetland locales were heavily settled. Numerous late Archaic sites have been found in coastal regions in northwest, southwest, and northeast Florida, and in the St. Johns River drainage. Such sites, representing the remains of villages, are characterized by extensive deposits of mollusks, snails and mussels at freshwater locations, and oysters along the coasts, which represent the remains of thousands of pre-Columbian meals. At both marine and freshwater settlements, fish and shellfish were dietary staples, as they were for many generations of later native Floridians. Late Archaic groups probably lived along most, if not all, of Florida's coasts, but many of their sites have been inundated by the sea rise that continued throughout the Archaic period as Pleistocene glaciers melted. This is certainly true around Tampa Bay, where dredging has revealed extensive shell middens that today are underwater. It is also likely that Paleo-Indian and early and Middle Archaic sites have been covered by the rising sea. Slightly before 2000 BC, the late Archaic villagers learned to make fired clay pottery, tempering it with Spanish moss or palmetto fibers. Sites with fiber-tempered pottery, some associated with massive shell middens, are distributed throughout the entire state, down to the Florida Keys. By the end of the late Archaic period, at 500 BC, many new types of fired clay pottery were being made by regional groups. Because different groups made their ceramic vessels in specific shapes and decorated them with distinctive designs, archaeologists can use pottery as a tool to define and study specific cultures. Often, those cultures are named for the modern geographical landmarks where their remains were first recognized. In some instances, we can trace, albeit incompletely, the evolution of these regional cultures from 500 BC into the 16th and 17th centuries, when European powers sought to colonize Florida. We can correlate the pre-Columbian archaeological cultures with Native American groups described in colonial period European documents. Each regional culture with its distinctive style of pottery tended to live within one major environmental or physiographic zone. Each developed an economic base and other cultural practices that were well suited to that particular region and its various habitats and resources. Like their Archaic and Paleo-Indian ancestors, the people associated with these post-500 BC regional cultures made a variety of stone tools as well. Today, examples of those tools are found throughout Florida, although they are more numerous in regions where chert, a flint-like stone, was mined from limestone deposits and fashioned into spear and arrow points, knives, scrapers, and a variety of other tools. East Florida, including the St. Johns River drainage from Brevard County north to Jacksonville, the adjacent Atlantic coastal region, and the many lakes of central Florida, was the region of the St. John's culture. Like the late archaic groups that preceded them, the St. John's people made extensive use of fish and shellfish and other wild foods. They hunted and collected the foods that could be found in the natural environment where they lived. By 100 BC, or shortly after, the St. John's people were constructing sand burial mounds in which to inter their dead. Each village had a leader or leaders who helped coordinate activities, such as communal ceremonies. Villagers most likely were organized into a number of lineages or other kin-based groups, each of which probably had a name and distinctive paraphernalia or other symbols of membership. When a village grew too large for its residents to be supported easily by local economic resources, one or more lineages broke away, establishing a new village nearby. Traditions and shared kinship and origins served to tie old and new villages together. Such a social system was probably present in nearly all of Florida at this same time. Although squashes and gourds probably were grown in gardens even in the late Archaic period, it was not until AD 750 or even later that some of the northerly St. John's peoples began to cultivate corn. Food production, in conjunction with hunting, collecting, and fishing, could support larger human populations. Many more post-AD 750 St. John's villages are known than earlier sites, reflecting this population increase. Agriculture, important to native groups in the central portion of peninsular Florida and the eastern panhandle, led to changes in lifeways. After about AD 1000, some of the St. John's groups living along the northern St. John's River constructed large sand mounds to serve as bases for temples or for residences in which their leaders lived. Larger populations, a desire to understand and try to control such things as agricultural fertility and rainfall, and the need for more social cooperation in order to maintain fields and protect territory, stimulated the development of more complex forms of political organization and new beliefs and ceremonial practices. With the coming of agriculture, village leaders were replaced by chiefs and religious figures who exercised control over the people and sought to bridge the gap between the villagers and the supernatural. Often, these chiefly and religious officials were associated with special objects and symbols, visible reminders of their power. Through alliances or the threat of military force, some chiefs sought to extend their political power and increase the territory under their aegis. At times, such leaders controlled outlying villages and their chiefs, receiving respect and tribute from those chiefs as symbols of their allegiance. Many villages of the St. John's region, some with large mounds, were inhabited in the early 16th century when Europeans first entered the interior of East Florida and traveled up the St. John's River. From that period on, we have written records left by those Europeans which offer first-hand descriptions of the early colonial period descendants of the St. John's people. Those descendants include many Eastern groups speaking the Timucuan language who lived along and near the St. John's River and its tributaries, groups with names like Satariwa, Utina, and Aquera. In northwest Florida and the interior of northern Florida and along the Gulf Coast from Cedar Key north, the earliest post-500 BC regional culture was called Deptford. Especially numerous in locales adjacent to the salt marshes and tidal streams of the Gulf Coast are village sites and fishing camps characterized by the distinctive Deptford pottery, decorated with check-stamped and grooved surface designs applied by using carved wooden or clay paddles to malleate the surface of the ceramic vessels before they were fired. Smaller hunting camps are found inland. In the Panhandle, after about AD 100, increased use of interior wetland and forest resources, especially the rivers and lakes in Gadsden, Leon, and Jefferson counties, led to the development of the Swift Creek culture out of the Deptford culture. Swift Creek, with its distinctive pottery stamped with geometric designs, was related to the Santa Rosa Swift Creek culture that followed Deptford in the western panhandle at about the same time. Influenced by cultures to the north of Florida, the ideology of the late Deptford and Swift Creek cultures was associated with a rich variety of ceramic, shell, stone, and even copper items, some traded into the state from the north. Many of these objects display stylized animal motifs representing the same species important to later native Floridians as well. Like the Deptford people who preceded them, the Swift Creek and Santa Rosa Swift Creek built sand mounds in which they interred their deceased relatives. Swift Creek villages are found in the interior of eastern northwest Florida, evidence that people were moving into that region, perhaps a result of continuing population increase. The Weeden Island culture and its coastal and inland regional variants appeared after about AD 300 from Sarasota County north along the Gulf Coast to Alabama, as well as in the interior of North and Northwest Florida. Weeden Island, named for a site on Old Tampa Bay in Pinellas County, excavated in the early 1920s, emerged out of local Deptford, Swift Creek, Santa Rosa Swift Creek, and related cultures that were present in that large area. Weeden Island villages, often with burial mounds and other mounds in association, are found in a variety of environments and geographical locations from Crystal River to near Lake City to Tallahassee and beyond to Pensacola. In each area, villagers practiced distinctive lifeways, but they shared many aspects of Weeden Island ideology and social and political organization. One Weeden Island variant culture was the Cades Pond culture of Alachua County and the western portion of Putnam County. Cades Pond peoples lived in villages adjacent to extensive wetlands, lakes, wet prairies, marshes, and the like, where they could fish and gather water birds and a wide variety of other wetland-dwelling animals. They also hunted in the adjacent forests and collected acorns, hickory nuts, and persimmons. Numerous Cades Pond mounds are known, some with Weeden Island pottery. Like the Swift Creek people in northwest Florida, Cades Pond villages took advantage of the resources in the interior away from the coast to establish settlements. Weeden Island variant cultures are also found around Tampa Bay, the Minnesota culture, and along the North Peninsular Gulf Coast. In those regions, people continued to practice the same patterns of subsistence as did their late archaic ancestors. Like the villagers in other Weeden Island cultures, they built mounds and manufactured and traded for ornate ceramic vessels and other objects displaying a rich array of symbols important to their beliefs. The ceramic complex associated with mounds is the defining characteristic of these cultures. Cultivation of corn appeared among the northern Weeden Island cultures after about AD 800, about the same time it did in the St. Johns region. In the eastern portion of northwest Florida, maize agriculture became particularly important to Aboriginal subsistence, providing, after AD 100, the economic base for the development and elaboration of the Fort Walton culture, which eventually stretched from the Osceola River west through the Panhandle. Fertile inland locales, especially the Tallahassee Hills zone of Leon and Jefferson counties and the upper Apalachicola River Valley, supported a number of large Fort Walton villages, some with mounds built as platforms on which to erect the temples and residences of chiefs and religious leaders. The Lake Jackson Mounds, in a state park near Tallahassee, is one such site. Fort Walton was the largest and most politically complex pre-Columbian culture in Florida. Separate political units, each consisting of a number of villages, village chiefs, and other officials, and outlying agricultural homesteads, all united under a paramount chief, vied with one another for power and territory. The Appalachian natives encountered by Spanish expeditions in the early colonial period were the descendants of pre-Columbian Fort Walton populations. West of the Fort Walton region in the western panhandle, influences from the north, from cultures in Alabama, provided the impetus for the development of the Pensacola culture. Pensacola villages and mounds are found clustered around the coastal bays from Choctawhatchee Bay west. The Pensacola people probably practiced agriculture, but it was not as extensive as the cleared field farming of the Fort Walton culture. Agriculture also was added to the economic system of the late Weeden Island period culture of North Florida, which occupied the region east of the Osceola River, north of the Santa Fe River, and west of the St. Johns River drainage. Named the Suwannee Valley culture, the people of this post-AD 750 culture also never practiced agriculture as extensively as did Fort Walton farmers. The descendants of the Suwannee Valley populations are the various western Timucua-speaking groups of Madison, Suwannee, Hamilton, and Columbia counties, who witnessed the passage of the Hernando de Soto expedition in 1539. They include, among others, the Ahuacalecan, Napituca, and Uzachile. Farther south, in north-central Florida, from the Santa Fe River down to Bellevue in Marion County, another culture replaced the Weeden Island period Cades Pond culture around AD 600. The Alachua culture represents a migration of a new population into Alachua and western Marion counties from the river valleys of southern Georgia. It is uncertain if this intrusive culture was associated with farming when it first appeared in north-central Florida, but by about AD 1250, if not before, we are certain that maize was being cultivated. Early in their history in Florida, the Alachua villages expanded westward into Levy and Dixie counties, although they apparently did not live on the coast itself, where villagers continued to make their livelihood from the marine environments. The Patano Indians, a Timucua-speaking native group, are the descendants of the Alachua population. Around Tampa Bay, a huge estuary capable of supporting large populations, the Weeden Island period culture developed into the Safety Harbor culture after about AD 900. Safety Harbor sites are found along the Gulf Coast, from Charlotte Harbor north to the Withlacoochee River in Citrus County. The Safety Harbor people on Tampa Bay probably were not farmers, but the villagers just north of Tampa Bay did grow corn, though it was not as important to their diet as it was in northwest Florida. Safety Harbor sites, some with huge heaps of shellfish as well as mounds and village areas, once dotted the shoreline of Tampa Bay, but many were destroyed around the turn of the 20th century when the shell was mined to build roads. Today, only a few of these large sites exist, such as the one at the Madeira Bickle Mound State Archaeological Site. Small triangular stone points were used by the Safety Harbor people to tip arrows. Similar points, suggesting bow and arrow use, are common in the contemporary Fort Walton, Suwannee Valley, and Alachua cultures in northern Florida. The colonial period Uzita, Mocoso, Pohoy, Tocobaga, and possibly the Ocal Indians all were Safety Harbor groups, and at least some of them, those living from Tampa Bay north, spoke Timucua. Like other North Florida native societies, all of these people of the Tampa Bay region were in contact with Spanish expeditions in the 16th century. The lifeways of the various regional cultures of southern Florida also were well established by 500 BC, the end of the late Archaic period. Although some beliefs and symbols were shared with the agricultural cultures farther north in Florida, the nature of the South Florida pre-Columbian cultures reflects their reliance on coastal and freshwater wetlands for their subsistence. The vast savanna around Lake Okeechobee, called by Florida natives Lake Miami, was the home of the Belle Glade culture. By as early as 400 BC, shortly after the end of the late Archaic period, the Belle Glade peoples evidently grew small amounts of maize. But the practice seems to have been abandoned by AD 500 or so, possibly because of increasingly wet conditions. The Belle Glade peoples built a remarkable series of villages, each containing mounds and earthen embankments and other earthworks, some in geometric shapes. They also dug ditches and canals. One such complex site is Fort Center in Glades County, where numerous wooden carvings of animals were found preserved in a pond. Belle Glade villagers continued to live around the lake and in the Kissimmee River drainage into early colonial times. The wetlands and savannas provided them with a rich assortment of fish, birds, turtles, alligator, and other animals, as well as plants. The Belle Glade culture was one of the most distinctive in all of Florida. Along the mangrove coasts and estuaries of southeast Florida, the coasts of the 10,000 Island region, and the coast of Monroe County north of the Florida Keys a distinctive regional culture developed. Hunter-gatherers, these glades culture people lived by fishing, gathering shellfish, and collecting plants and other animals. Numerous glade sites also are found in the Everglades.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?